Hello, ladies and gentlemen. For our remote lesson today, we're going to be doing a fairly short lesson, fairly short presentation on Russian industrialization, talking about how Russia and why Russia industrialized, where it succeeded and where it failed. Now, you'll notice I've subtitled this one a mixed bag, and that is because unlike our last two countries, we looked at Germany, we looked at the United States, and we pretty much unabashedly said, yeah, they did a pretty good job. Um, that's not going to be the case with Russia. Now, Russia's not going to fail to industrialize. Russia, by pretty much all accounts, was moving in the right direction at the time World War I happened. A lot of analysts, especially German ones, were worried that Russia was going to catch up industrially. But the effects of industrialization on Russian society are going to be a lot more unfortunate for the folks at the top, eventually at least. Than what we saw in Britain or certainly the US and Germany. So let's go ahead and get this over with. Should be pretty quick. This is actually a pretty short little lesson. Okay, so at the start of the industrial period, by the way, shout out to Tsar Alexander the First there. Absolutely fantastic facial hair. Um, at the start of the industrial period, Russia was pretty much, it wasn't quite medieval, but it was close. You had a true absolute monarch. Remember, we said Kaiser Wilhelm had to sell a little bit of power to the Reichstag. He had to give them a little bit. Of course, Britain had a constitutional monarch. The United States had a democratic republic, albeit one where a decent contingent of people still couldn't vote. But Russia was an autocracy. Russia was still a nation where the word of the Tsar was law. And the majority of Russia's population had actually only fairly newly been freed. In 1861, Russia finally ended serfdom, a policy that had lasted for so long, you probably remember we talked about it on the first day of this class. And social change, because of that, came from the top down in Russian history for the most part. It's coming from the top down. You know, the last time we looked at Russia, we talked about some of the changes and trading stuff that they had done, and it was pretty much all coming from czars, and that's going to continue up till the early 1900s. American social change tended to come from the bottom, as did British social change. We talked about how the middle class had gotten the right to vote in Britain. That was something a lot of you guys put on the Jamboard. We talked about how in the United States, we've seen social change coming from like labor unions and that sort of thing. Russia, not so much. And in 1860, Russia begins industrialization in a way, and this is really important. This is kind of your, okay, you need to write this down moment. Russia begins its industrialization program, which is directed by the state. It is directed by the nation. And that is a hugely different thing than the way Britain and the US and even Germany did things. I say even Germany because it had a vaguely autocratic monarch, but the US and Britain and Germany, you have individual factory owners. Sorry for the camera shaking. Melvin, stop scratching your face. Um, you had individual factory owners building their stuff. For the Russian state, it is them saying, no, you build a factory here. This is not Henry Ford deciding to build his automobile plants in Michigan because that's where he was from. This is, you are going to build your textile mill here because it's where the czar says we need a textile mill. Really need to know that. That's really important. This is state-directed industrialization. And we're going to see that a couple more times in this class, and usually more often than not, and I find this very surprising. Usually state-directed industrialization is kind of a failure. China didn't succeed, the Ottomans didn't succeed, Japan did, but they're the only really major example I can think of state-level industrialization working in this era. Now we're going to see state industrialization work in a lot of communist nations in the 20th century, but we're not there yet. Okay, Russian industrialization really did take off quite rapidly because it was a directed industrialization by the state. By 1900, it is fourth in the world in steel production, behind the US, Britain, and Germany. And it also, like the US, is quite large. It had a lot of natural resources. But it's not a nationwide phenomenon. Most of Russia's industrialization was concentrated in the big cities. Moscow, of course, but that wasn't the capital at the time. St. Petersburg was, Kiev, and what is now the Ukraine. This factory was in Lodz, which is now in Poland. But what I'm getting at here is that these factories were being built where there were already people. Now, yes, that makes sense, but it also means that the vast majority of Russia was still extremely rural. Um, and just like what we see in Europe as well as the United States, lots of people, as farming does improve on those farms outside of major cities, do in fact move to these towns, especially the three listed there, and they find the traditional combination of long hours, low pay, and unsafe working conditions. All right, and the state running the show definitely causes even more clash troubles in Russia. Like, this is a picture of a union meeting. Hopefully, you notice that they're a little bit more armed than people tend to be at most union meetings. Uh, the middle class, which Russian industrialization created, and it did create one, was that they wanted more freedoms. They wanted to do what Britain did. They wanted to get the right to vote. They wanted to have the ability to gain some political rights. But they also depended upon, that gummit cat, they also depended upon the extremely conservative monarchy and the apparatus around it to keep the lower classes repressed, and much more so than in Britain, the US, or Germany. The middle class and upper class were really quite scared of the lowest classes who, again, way more than the three countries we've already looked at, begin to radicalize. They develop a radical political philosophy with a lot of Russians clinging to Marxism, clinging to hardcore communism. Now, we haven't talked about that yet, but it is very important to remember. One of the things people forget, or people don't know if they haven't read Marx, is a lot of people try to portray Marxism or communism as kinder and gentler, and you can make a case for that with like democratic socialism. You can't make that case with Marx. Marx's writings pretty much all straight up say, rise up, kill the rich, take their stuff. That's an oversimplification, but it ain't much of one. Like, Marxist revolution is going to be violent. That's the whole point of a Marxist revolution. Now, if you're noticing a lot of parallels between the way Russia was operating in the late 18 and early 1900s and the way France was looking in the French Revolution, good job. That's a great connection to make, and it's also a pretty solid one because they're very similar. You have an outmoded political structure, an unfair political system, a changing world around it, and something has to break. Okay. In 1905, as we will discuss when we get to the lesson on Japan, Russia loses a war to the Japanese. Now, not only does this make them the first European power to lose to an Asian power since the era of the Mongols, it is also not like a close and narrow, ooh, we fought real good defeat. It's a crushing defeat. And what we see is the hard left Labor Party rises up in rebellion. Now, keep in mind, political parties in this era in Russia were illegal anyway, and so the Labor Party rising up and trying to create this massive rebellion was really quite a surprise. Workers go on strike. You can see the main heart of Russia, European Russia, which is by far the most populated region, as well as these major cities, St. Petersburg, Moscow, Sevastopol, Warsaw, all begin to have these rather large rebellions against the state. Um, the 1905 revolution is short because the military is going to come in and crush the rebels, but it is also a pretty big harbinger of what is to come. The 1905 revolution, which by the way you can watch one story of on the amazing silent film Battleship Potemkin, was a really, really, really big deal because it is basically a class-based civil war. Now, this one fails, but if you know anything about Russian/Soviet history, you know that the next one isn't going to. All right, so Tsar Nicholas II, who was the leader of Russia by this point, recognizes that he's got to fix this. And he recognizes that even though he doesn't want to see the type of change the revolutionaries are arguing for, things cannot stay the same. So Russia legalizes political parties. You can now vote. Uh, it has a constitution now, finally, instead of just the Tsar's word is law, and it establishes a body called the Duma. The Duma is the Russian parliament, but the Duma is the very definition of a useless gift. Um, because the Duma could be dismissed by the Tsar. So, to give you an example, the Duma at one point in time grew too liberal for the Tsar's liking, so he dissolved it and had new elections. Most of the same people were elected. The Duma was still too liberal, so the Tsar dissolved it again in the same year, and then they finally elected one conservative enough for him to work with. He could also abrogate, that is, deny, any laws or overturn any laws passed by the Tsar. So, yeah, that one pretty useless. And Russia is still unhappy. Over 40% of the workforce went on strike in the first half of 1914, the last year before the First World War started. Well, the year the First World War started, but it started almost exactly halfway through 1914. Work with me here. It is late and I am tired. Um, but Russia is still not a happy state by this point, and let's see how that's going to go. Here's our conclusion. All right, so again, the reforms were not sufficient. One author that I read describing the state of Russia was like it was trying to fix somebody who's just had a limb amputated by giving them one band-aid. It was bad. Laborers were not at all represented, so huge chunk of the workforce isn't represented in the Duma at all. The middle class is barely represented by the Duma, which again is almost powerless, and revolutionaries are still there. They are waiting in the wings. And most of these revolutionaries are hard left. There's some hard right. I can't really call them proto-fascists, but they're really hard right, wanting to rebel, but for the most part, it is hardcore leftists who are organizing, operating, and linking themselves throughout town. Some of you may have seen it in the slide with the map. A lot of these groups begin to form local councils, and the Russian word for a local council is a Soviet. So you can probably tell where this is going. And they're waiting for their moment to rebel. And when World War I comes out, for a while they go underground. But once 1917 rolls around, Russia is going to revolt. And I would put more or less verbatim this last bit. Russia is the only nation that is going to have a socialist revolt come directly from industrialization. Now, a lot of nations are going to develop a socialist party. I mean, we saw the United States developed one in our previous lesson. A lot of places are going to develop a socialist party of some kind, but only in Russia are we going to see a full-on violent socialist revolt. And we'll see that in unit number 7, right smack dab in the middle, well, okay, a little bit towards the end, of World War I. Okay, thank you guys for listening. Have a great evening. There's some questions on Canvas associated with this video link. That's your remote lesson. Should be an easy 100. And I will see you all on Monday. Bye-bye.